It's currently being remote moused by Gary McKinnon.
I saw your face on the telly.
How you gonna A if you aren't that bright? How you gonna B, Bopaloola? How you gonna C if you can't stand up? How you gonna D if you don't know? How you gonna E if you're everywhere? How you gonna F if they won't let you swear? How you gonna G force? How you gonna H if it hurts? How you gonna I if you've no insight? How you gonna J if your job won't light? How you gonna K if you're knackered? How you gonna L if you're lacquered? How you gonna M if you're murdered? How you gonna N if you're not? How you gonna O if you won't, my God? How you gonna P if you've lost the plot? How you gonna Q if the quid won't come? How you gonna R if your legs won't run? How you gonna S if you slide? How you gonna T if you're total? How you gonna U if you're underground? How you gonna V if you're very sorry? How you gonna W if you worry? How you gonna X if you're not Chinese? How you gonna Y, I don't know? How you gonna Z if you can't sleep? How you gonna Y, I don't know? How you gonna Z if you can't sleep? How you gonna A if you're always angry? How you gonna B if your legs are badly? How you gonna C if you've got no eyes? How you gonna D if you don't? How you gonna E if your drugs don't come? How you gonna F if you forget? How you gonna G if you're gone? How you gonna H if there's no one home? How you gonna I if you still can't see? How you gonna J if you jump her? How you gonna K if you koala? How you gonna L if you lump her? How you gonna M if you're mooning? How you gonna N if you're nude? How you gonna O when you get too old? How you gonna P then? How you gonna Q if you've got no line? How you gonna R if you've got no rhyme? How you gonna S if you're slow? How you gonna T if you've got no milk? How you gonna U like you usually do? How you gonna B if you've got no view? How you gonna W Bush? Who you gonna X now he's not here? How you gonna Y, I don't know? How you gonna Z if you can't sleep? How you gonna Y, I don't know? How you gonna Z if you can't sleep? See what you got, big boy? How you gonna A when it's Armageddon? How you gonna B when the beast comes begging? How you gonna C when the Christ child calls? How you gonna D when you're dead? How you gonna E when it never eases? How you gonna F when it freezes over? How you gonna G when the gun comes? How you gonna H when it's hell? How you gonna I in the Ice Age? How you gonna J, you Judas? How you gonna K if you're special? How you gonna L when it's all laid bare? How you gonna M in the meltdown? How you gonna M when it's nigh? How you gonna O dear? How you gonna P when you're on the pyre? How you gonna Q when it's all too quick? How you gonna R when you're laid to rest? How you gonna S in the silence? How you gonna T when you fail the test? How you gonna U ungrateful bastard? How you gonna B if you didn't vote? How you gonna W wallaby? How you gonna existentially? How you gonna Y, I don't know? How you gonna Z if you can't see? How you gonna Y, I don't know? How you gonna Z if you